Well, thank you for joining me today, ladies. I'm Dr. Hugo Stevenson, and me and my team are recording the second episode of the practice, the podcast that we have started in order to bring forward some ideas of how, from the point of view of a practice, of a psychological practice, we see different phenomena and different situations in the clinical work. So today we're going to be talking about PTSD, and in particular, we're going to be talking about complex PTSD in first responders. And to start our podcast, I would like to share the screen and read something to you from a first responder. It is here, and it says, I am a proud father and a humbled husband. I'm a black metal fanatic and a music collector. I'm also a paramedic. I have PTSD. I worked on the road for 15 years before being diagnosed. I have not worked since May of 2017. I clung on as long as I could, refusing to believe I had psychiatric problems. Not me. I was often angry, and I would overreact to the children being children. Nothing was fun anymore. I couldn't sleep properly. I was isolating. I was booking off sick so often. I was taking unpaid sick days. When I did make it to work, I was so anxious, I would sometimes end up fighting off the tears in the truck between calls. My marriage was falling apart. We weren't fighting, we had gone silent. I couldn't get certain calls off my mind. I was drinking heavily. I was smoking pot heavily, even for me. I was having thoughts of overdosing to save my family from the shitty person I had become. You get the picture. It was a bad place. So I find these words very, very powerful. And to me, they represent, in a very general way, how first responders come to us after many years of quietly suffering and not even knowing what it is that they're suffering from. It is a situation where sometimes it is not themselves who come to us because they think they have PTSD, but because family members or even coworkers may point out to them what they see in terms of behavioral changes. I think it would be good for us to differentiate at this point what we're talking about, and we're not talking about a single event, traumatic event, where a person sees death or has an encounter with something extremely traumatic involving death or the possibility of dying. And from that moment on, that person will be manifesting symptoms consistent with what the DSM-5, with the symptomatology that is considered to be PTSD. But we are dealing with individuals who have, for many, many years, been exposed. Their brains have been exposed to accumulation of traumatic calls involving death, involving blood, involving the possibility of themselves, dying. And it is the accumulation of these events which eventually begins to manifest through many behavioral changes. And as you can see in the list of symptoms, the list of complaints that the paramedic I just read was mentioning, you see the changes in the relationship system, the changes with his wife, the changes with the children, the difficulties with accepting, as he says, children being children, the isolation, the drinking, the suicidal ideation is is a situation that goes beyond simply having flashbacks or simply avoiding certain situations. It goes way beyond that. So I think this opens the conversation today for us to approach our work and present our work in how we see this situation when someone with complex PTSD comes to us? What do you think?
I think what was striking for me about the story as I was listening to it is that often I think when people come in for help, they don't necessarily say I'm suffering from flashbacks or things like that, but it's more about the irritability, the frustration, the family relationships that start to get strained. So what struck me about it is that in the reading, we see a lot of that go is when he mentions this idea of, I was getting upset at children being children. So mundane things become harder to cope with.
Absolutely.
I had the recollection. I don't know if you guys ever watched that movie, The American Sniper. It's a few years back. It's a movie about a sniper who apparently had the record of tours in the war, and he had the record of having killed the most enemies. And there's a situation in the movie where we see the movie kind of at the DSM in presented through Hollywood, and you see the sniper isolating the changes in mood, and there's a scene where his child is having his birthday party, and the child is in the backyard and playing with the dog, and in his head, what he sees, he misconstrues the scene as the dog attacking the child. Next thing you know, you see the character with the dog in one hand by the neck, and he has his belt on the other one. He's about to strike the dog, and the wife yells his name, calls him out, and he freezes and he stops. The next scene in the movie is the sniper. He goes to see a psychiatrist. So we imagine that after that scene, the wife had a conversation with him and say, "Look, I'm seeing certain changes. That you're not the same person. I want you to go and talk to somebody." So he goes to see the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says, "Okay, so I understand that you've had many tours." And he says, "Yes." And he says, "I understand that you've killed many people too." And he says, "Yes." And then the psychiatrist asks him, "Do you think that in the course of your duties, you may have done things or you may have seen things that may have affected you?" And his answer is, "No, not at all, not at all. I don't think I have any problems because of what I did." So sometimes for the sufferer, the connection between what they've been through, what they've done, and their symptoms is not readily apparent, but it's more apparent to those around the person. So that's why it is very often the case that we receive a first responder, not alone, but they often come with their spouse. They often come with someone who says, "I'm really concerned about my partner. He or she is not the same." So I think that's an important question to keep in mind, that they are not necessarily individuals who would make an association between the changes in their behavior, the changes in their mood, the changes in their thought, and what they've been through. I don't know if that's your experience.
Well, I think, what you're saying is absolutely right. It takes so much for many people who are first responders to just realize that they need the support and the help. On average, it takes many, many, many years, as evidenced by the reading you just read from a paramedic, to just even recognize that their life has changed considerably. And if it doesn't take many years for the person suffering themselves to recognize it, you're right, absolutely, their family might raise some flags first.
Right.
I'm wondering
And,
too.
yeah.
Go ahead. No, I was just wondering too if we can touch a little bit upon sometimes a question that often comes up when people come in for consultation is, I don't know why this last event that happened a month ago, which is very minor, or this call that I attended that's minor has really destabilized me. When look, in the past, I've attended or I've been part of much more difficult calls. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that, because often I think that's what gets disqualified. Oh, this must not be work related. Because look, I've done worse things and those didn't impact me, yet this call really got me to go down a downward spiral. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that, because I think it's a question that often comes up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Do you want to take a stab?
Yeah,
Or you want me to talk about it?
I think that's the, the I've seen so much worse story, right? Why me, not my coworker? That those comparing reactions with colleagues, why do I have PTSD and my coworker doesn't? It's a little bit of a sensitive and interesting topic because for every person it's different. There's pre-existing trauma, there's family challenges, marital issues evolve alongside the PTSD. And I think as clinicians, it's important for us to educate that this complex PTSD and PTSD looks different for everyone and is experienced differently by different people. And I think that's a really significant moment as a clinician when I'm sitting and holding space for a first responder, because it is that direct acknowledgement of the challenging things that they have witnessed, even in the face of maybe, outwardly or explicitly saying, oh no, nothing's ever bothered me. I'm okay, I'm good. But there is this sense of why me? Why am I feeling this way? Why am I, picking up the dog? Why am I doing this? And so I think that's a way in to say, hey, is there something else that you're not looking at here?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very, very common situation as well. What I refer, how I refer to that situation is I use the analogy with the last straw that broke the camel's back. It's a common expression, and in this case, it goes to signify that by the time the last straw hit the camel's back, we actually had no information as to how many straws were there before. We don't know how long had the camel been carrying those many straws. We don't know if the camel had on any other pre-existing conditions, or what about the history of the camel could account for this. We actually don't know if it was a big straw or a small straw.
Yep.
We just know it was the last one. We know that the camel could not take it any longer. So because of that, it is often the case that it's not the most terrifying call that broke the camel back. It could be a smaller one, relatively speaking. And that can be quite puzzling for the first responder, because you're right. They will say, I've handled so much more than this. What is the one that now keeps coming back? Well, it's because of the cumulative effect. We're not dealing with, again, we're not dealing with one specific call. We're dealing with the accumulation of calls. And also there's a second factor, which is an aging brain. It's not the same, the calls that you had when you were 22, 27, and the calls you have when you're 37, 39, and 42, and so on. It's an aging brain, and your responses are probably not going to be the same as you were before, and life is going to be more complicated for you as well. But yes, it is the last straw that broke the camel's back, and that may be what brought you to the consulting room. And going back to what I said at the beginning, it may not even be that call. It may be, that your spouse has reached a point where it says, I can't deal with this anymore. I cannot deal with your irritability. For example, one of the most common complaints that we see in first responders is the situation with irritability, they call flying off the handle over minutia, over very small things, the lack of tolerance for the children. For example, children's crying, screaming is a typical complaint by first responders, that they get really irritated, they can't tolerate it. Or it could be something else like alcoholism as a way of, using a maladaptive way for tension reducing, or excessive use of uh, weed as well, or just difficulties in the relationship, changes in libido, changes in the quality of the connection. So all of these factors may be the symptom that brings them into our consulting room, as opposed to, hey, I'm here because I believe I suffer from PTSD, which as individuals become more educated about what PTSD is, and many workplaces have been doing, a great job in terms of educating their employees, that may be the case, but not necessarily. And that brings me to another question, which is, by the time a first responder comes to us, many aspects of his life or her life may be affected, like relationship with the children, relationship with the spouse. The spouse may be at a point of actually considering the end to the relationship or the marriage. It could be a situation with, severe alcoholism. It could be a situation where the first responder has been considering suicide for a while. So the question I have is that, where do you begin the treatment? If, for example, the most important, clinically speaking, the most important issue at hand is, let's say, the relationship with the spouse. It's not necessarily the flashbacks. It's not necessarily the excessive drinking of alcohol, but the issue is the relationship with the spouse. And then you can have a first responder who has a spouse who is a supporting spouse, and wants to help him or her to deal with his recovery or her recovery. Or you may have the same individual doing therapy, but now is grieving the end of a relationship. So where do you begin the treatment is an important consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of trauma treatment, especially in first responder populations, is prescriptive, right? There is the exposure therapy, there is EMDR, there, is CPT, and these acronyms are, eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, and cognitive processing therapy. And so I think there's sometimes room to be flexible, to understand that there's a whole person coming to the office. And I think first things first, we start with assessment and to meet the client where they are. Because to do any work, regardless of whether you're working on the relationship, or you're managing grief from the loss of a potential relationship, or you're working on calls, there is a need to assess what is it that we're really working with here, and to meet the client where they are. First responders might not always come to us with a perfect motivation or desire to address the things that they're dealing with. And, we as clinicians want to address where is the most harm that we need to focus on first and foremost. So if they're actively suicidal, that's maybe something that we do first. But asking the client what's most important for them, establishing trust, building rapport. I think that is best practice, for any sort of PTSD or CPTSD, complex PTSD work, which is really balancing the amount of harm that the client kind of poses to themselves with the risks, right? And then also the client's motivation. And then really, what are they really coming into the session for? Are they coming in to process, a little bit of traumatic grief because their irritability, really, their wife, their spouse, their partner, they're at the end of their rope and they say, you have to leave. And that's maybe how they end up on the couch in our offices. And so I think meeting them where they are is exceedingly important.
Yeah. And something too that comes up for me is that the quality of our relationships really impact the quality of our life. And I think when somebody comes in, especially if it's their first time seeking treatment, we often see that the quality of the relationships has really taken a hit. So that's about prioritizing, okay, what are we working with here? Yes, you've got flashbacks, you've got nightmares, but we know that PTSD, management of PTSD symptoms becomes harder as the environment becomes more stressful. So if we're dealing with divorce on top of that, if we're dealing with a rupture with our relationship with our children or with our spouse, that calls action to target those areas first, so that the byproduct of that can actually be management of other PTSD symptoms like the flashbacks or the substance use that may come with that. So I think it's important to take into consideration, what is the priority here?
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. I agree. I
Yes,
think
yes.
that is, you hit the nail on the head when it comes to priority. And I think just to add to what you just said is that, really what we're talking about is stabilization. Is your life stable enough for you to do this tough work? Like you said, if you're dealing with real ruptures and divorce, you might not necessarily be at a place where you can process that, because you're focused on what's going to happen when I walk through my front door. Really, what's the priority?
Yeah, and this is going to place us sometimes as clinicians, going to place us in a bit of a difficult spot. For example, if the individual we're seeing is being covered under a WSIB claim, and as clinicians, we decided that we talked to the client, as you said, and it seems that the priority here is to contain, to stabilize, to remove the stress from, let's say, the couple's issues. And we were to present that to the WSIB as, the next 12 sessions are going to be couples therapy. We strongly believe that this is what this individual requires. It may become an issue as the case manager will say, well, but this is a couples issue. This is not related to the traumatic calls that we, filled in form. You say, May 2011, and June 2013, something happened there. We want the treatment to be focused on that. We want you to do cognitive processing therapy. We want you to do EMDR, and, related to the traumatic events themselves. Yet clinically, the effects of the cumulative PTSD has been, the most in terms of the capacity for relationship, to have a sound relationship for that individual. So this could be a bit of a problem sometimes in how we handle this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think often there's a number of sessions that we hear of, right? People either come in and they say, I've been approved for this many sessions and things like that. And I think that sets the stage up sometimes for the patient or the client to put a quantity on how long they should be in therapy to expect recovery. So I think it's worth to mention, what does recovery from PTSD look like? Is this something that I can recover from? Is this something that's curable? What does it look like? When can I go back to work if I've been off work? When can I continue to practice in my profession? I think it's also a merit to look at that, because often what we get is people coming in, they've been allotted a certain number of sessions, and in their minds that becomes the marker for recovery. So if I've reached the 12 sessions and I'm still struggling, does that mean that I'm incurable of this? And I think it's important to get an idea, if we can discuss a little bit of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. Megan, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think, there's always this catch-22 and the shame of, like, should I go back to work versus the reality of, can I go back to work, right? Is it realistic for me to, be able to return to my daily activities in the workplace if I'm really just not functional and I'm not able to do that? And so I think it's not always a matter of should I or am I incurable, or, my 12 sessions are up. It's like, can you go back to work right now? And having real conversations with clients about that is important. You know, there's not.
I think yes, you're touching a very, very important point here, which is the shame of being in treatment, the shame of feeling longer the person you were, and you thought that you were going to be able to survive this job. I often tell first responders and say, you know, look, you went to school, you got a degree, you got a diploma, you went through a ceremony, you got a uniform, and you went to work. You know, the uniform and the diploma, the certificate, they do not act like a magic cape. They do not act like a magic shield that's going to protect you from PTSD. You are a human being exactly like any other human being. And the difference between the two of you is not the diploma. I mean, you have some training, but both your brains, the trained brain and the untrained brain, are still human brains, and they're going to suffer the impact of this cult. Now, we are moving towards a culture of vulnerability, a culture where, you know, it is okay to go to your colleague and say, you know, I can't shake it off. I'm still thinking about that call. And you can actually openly say, I'm talking to a psychologist and receiving therapy. But these are still, you know, early times. This is a new period. We're coming from generations and generations where the idea was that you have to tough it out. We're coming from, you know, generations where, you know, if you went back to work and you were accommodated, you would be called a broken toy, a dysfunctional toy. And there's a you know, significant stigma, significant shame associated with that. So very often I do come across first responders who are more than eager to go back to work. You know, the first question is, when am I going back to work? Because the idea of being off work for prolonged periods of times brings about, you know, that shame of, you know, what is it that my colleagues are going to think of me? Many of them are going to be thinking that I'm just milking it, that there's no such thing as PTSD, and I need to go back to work. And so education continues to be one of the most powerful tools we have at our disposal, and educating them as to what it is that PTSD is, what complex PTSD is, and what does, you know, recovery look like, are significant pieces in our game plan as clinicians. I often lean on the analogy with physical activities, with physiotherapy, with injuries that are related to the body, because it's so concrete that it allows someone to easily understand what we mean by an injury. And many first responders, you know, they have injuries in their back. Some of them, you know, are prevented from working out as a result of that injury. And I often say, well, let's say that, you injured your back and you're receiving physiotherapy treatment for that injury. Let's say that you recover. Now, what are the odds that once you're, back to work, you will allow yourself to, let's say, go back to the gym and squat a high weight, or deadlift, a high weight as well, where the chances that you're going to expose yourself to the possibility of re-injury? Or what if your physiotherapist tells you you're good, you can undertake most activities. However, I will caution you against lifting heavy weights. So likewise, your recovery when you're a first responder may include some modifications in terms of your work duties, precisely to prevent re-injury. And as a patient, and not just as a first responder, as a patient, you must come around this. You must, wrap your head around the idea of recovery and what it means. A recovery doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be 100% able to undertake the same duties that you were taking before. And this takes a lot of work, and this takes a lot of conscience from the individual in treatment. Another aspect that is very important to talk about is that we are not just talking about the whether you can be safe at work. We're also talking about us as a community. Are we going to be safe with you doing your job? When you go back to work, can we trust that you're not going to freeze? Can we trust you're not going to overact? Can we trust that? So it's not just about your safety, it's about our safety. And therefore, it's a collaborative kind of work that involves lots of education and lots of discussions as to what recovery is going to look like in every particular case.
And that includes, I think, what I often find that even for a therapist, we often miss this part here, which I've been more attuned to, which is this idea of grief and loss. I think there's a lot of grief and loss over that. There's a whole identity that comes with being a first responder, a member of the military. There's a culture that comes with it. There's a perceived sense of morality, code of honor that you have towards your family, towards your community. So it doesn't just stop when you go home. And I think what I often find is that as part of doing PTSD work, the very same things that have helped these patients be successful at their jobs is this ability to detach from emotion at the time of when the event is happening. But that very ability to detach and avoid that emotional flooding that may come up when one gets called to an event is the very same thing sometimes that keeps PTSD going, which is avoidance of emotional stimuli, avoidance of thinking about calls or talking about calls. And I often find the reconstruction of that, the deconstruction of it, I should say, which is in therapy, we do the complete opposite of avoiding. We find that we want to talk about what's happening. We want to feel things. We want to make sure that what we're feeling is that primary emotion of guilt, perhaps, or anger, or sadness. And so the very same thing that can make somebody very successful in this type of field is also the very same thing that in therapy we're trying to a certain degree build more flexibility around. And that I think includes a lot of loss of identity and grief that also has to be processed as part of targeting PTSD in therapy.
You know, you hit the nail on the head. I think it is this dual process of learning about the PTSD and also unlearning the ways in which they've managed the symptoms in some way, because that grief and loss is really in, it's in reflection of, well, who am I if I do not just immediately detach or avoid? What is my work life going to be like if I take a moment to process and acknowledge what I have seen or what is happening in my mind, in my body right now? And, as clinicians, we really want to be present with first responders to acknowledge and to validate for them that this is a worthy and important process. And in fact, it's actually the thing that will create the satisfaction and the holistic feeling of bringing yourself to work, because you're not compartmentalizing and cordoning off certain bits and pieces so that you can function. And, there's a little bit of flexibility and bending and fluidity that comes in the session to orient the client to this. But I think that's probably one of the most significant things that we can do, is to let them know by modeling and by teaching and showing them how to bring compassion and pace to themselves when they are feeling difficult things, that is something that will help them in the work that they do, not harm them.
Correct. I wonder if we could touch on, what it is that the first responders should be aware of. What are the earliest symptoms or indications that something may not be as before. when is a good time to, reach out for help? You have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, we've touched on a
Yeah,
few
I
of
think
those.
something that often comes up. Go ahead.
It's that, their family maybe tells them that they've been flying off the handle for small things. Some of those things, little irritabilities, things that you previously enjoy are not meaningful. Those are all important things. And I'm curious to hear, what your thoughts are on this too. What do you notice?
Often I think when people come in, and I'm going to use words that patients come in here, because I think it's really important to make this relatable to people listening as well, right? And what I hear a lot is they feel a sense of complacency in the job. They feel a sense of burnout. They feel a sense of indifference. They feel kind of like they start feeling lack of compassion towards the calls that they go into. And that brings on a lot of shame and embarrassment. They start feeling a sense of they get frustrated at things that before wouldn't have frustrated them as much. So there's a shorter window of tolerance for emotional dysregulation. That's what I often find that people coming in through the door, they start describing, and they might misinterpret that as I'm a bad person. But really, when we're looking at it on closely, it's got to do with these types of symptoms, which is this burnout, feeling of indifference, complacency, lack of sleep, or thinking about things, or losing track of time, feeling anxiety and don't know why, feelings of panic and don't know why. That's what I often hear people coming in through the door with.
Mm-hmm.
I like to put emphasis on one of the symptoms that you both mentioned, which is the irritability, the flying off the handle. That seems to be a fairly frequent complaint that individuals around you as a person, your friends, your family, your spouse, your children, your parents, they begin to complain about that. It takes very, very little for you to get very, very irritated, and you fly off the handle. And we are noticing that we're walking on eggshells around you. That's a very typical one. You were referring to the changes in how they see themselves at work and what work means for them. So some form of cynicism, if you notice some form of cynicism emerging in you, that the job you do is no longer as meaningful as when you first started, that you just counting the days until retirement, that every day to go into work is a huge drag. That's a big one as well. The calls don't mean the same to you. That'll be a significant one. I like to put one on the table that is difficult to talk about, but it represents significant escalation in the deterioration, the emotional deterioration due to PTSD, and that is passive suicidal ideation, right? If you, as a first responder, you begin to think what it would be like to end your life. You begin to think about individuals who, calls you went to where the person had committed suicide. Begin to fantasize about that. If you're a police officer, you begin to think about colleagues of yours who committed suicide. In policing, there's the expression, eating your gun. If you begin to, sort of fantasize or have that in your mind, that will be a significant symptom. If you're a firefighter and you begin to entertain the thought of what it would be like to, jump in the fire, that it will take very, very little for you to die. You begin to think about that. You begin to, taking drugs and killing yourself. That will be a significant escalation if you're passively, thinking about these things that come to you. If that happens, by all means, it's very important that you do reach out to clinicians in the community. I don't use the word community lightly. I think is important to understand that we're basically talking about from community workers, which is what we are, to community workers. So, you know, you're the first responders who go to those difficult calls. And we're community workers. We're here to help our fellow community workers with their mental health because we need you out there. And that's what we do best. We help you, with your emotions. We help you with your thoughts. We help you with your relationship to a point where, treatment will become even more challenging.
Yeah, and I think an additional thing, to consider on top of all of these symptoms that we have already described is, you might also notice a lot of secrecy, a lot of concealment, of people that you might not have previously been closed off to. So family, loved ones, you might really try to hide some of these experiences, especially if you have been considering ending your life, because it is really, really difficult to think those thoughts. And, just speaking from my own experience working with first responders, sometimes it's hard to even bring that up in session, to even name that that is something that is being thought or considered. And, like you said, Hugo, it's this sense of we are also community workers showing up for you. And so we are not fearful of these symptoms. These are symptoms that cause great destabilization at work and in your community, but this is what we are here for. And we are, open to having honest and frank conversations about what this looks like for first responders in their life, and really kind of breaking down and disintegrating the shame and the secrecy that comes with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would like to say. Sometimes I finish my sessions with first responders or members of the military, and at the end it can be hard sometimes to talk about all of this. Sometimes it's the first time, and I usually say, we need to let the air get at it a little bit. You've been kind of hiding it. Let the air get at it a little bit. Let's explore a little bit about what's happening. So I really recommend that people, if you're struggling with any of this, reach out. There's different modalities. There's groups that you can attend. There's individual therapy. Look for trained professionals that are able to help you out so that you can let the air get at it a little bit more.
I think so. Any parting thoughts?
No, I think we covered a lot. Yeah. I think we covered a lot.
I mean, if we covered how first responders come to us, if we covered the difference between complex PTSD and PTSD, if we explained how the treatment is going to go, we touched on the stigma of reaching out, we touched on the symptoms that show you that something may not be working properly in your emotional system, and if we expressed our desire to help you recover, I think we covered a good piece of this topic.
Yeah, I think so.
Agreed.
All right, a pleasure talking to you. See you in the next podcast.
Same to you.
You.